Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good morning in India, Singapore, Japan, and early morning in Europe. And those of you who are from US, good evening. I am Saideep Ratnam. I am the Chief Operating Officer at MIJSC at IIMB. Mizuho India Japan Study Center is actually a center of excellence at IIM Bangalore. And we are delighted to welcome all of you to the MIJSC's 7th panel discussion webinar, the Meijin Samvad, as we like to call it. Basically, it's an expert conversation. And this is actually, if you look at the webinar series itself, this is the 25th. So we are quarter way to the Century Club. This webinar this webinar series, in fact, aims to foster a discussion on a specific topic amongst a select group of esteemed experts, panelists who have joined from India, Japan, rest of the world, who will share their diverse perspectives with a larger audience. And our panelists generally are experts in their respective fields, and they provide valuable insights and high quality information in the areas of management, technology, society, culture. Before we go straight into the discussion itself, let me just give you a brief intro about our center and about our panelists today. MIJSC, as I mentioned earlier, is a center of excellence, basically set up to serve as a facilitator for collaborative initiatives amongst academia, industry, the government agencies, the policymakers of both India, Japan, as two countries, on topics of mutual interest. The focus has been to strengthen the India and Japan bonds by promoting academic, industry, as well as societal linkages. So if we look at it, I will start with Professor Ramkrishna Sharan. Who has joined us just now. I mean, he is on the line today with us. He's a professor at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is a PhD from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he's a postdoc fellow at the Center for Global Development. His research focuses on the developmental economics and the political economy, emphasizing on inequality in socially diverse settings, and the empowerment which needs to be given to the marginalized groups through both institutional and through technological innovations. He has worked on grievance redressal mechanisms, the role of local government actors, consequences of reservation for in India for the Dalits or the underprivileged people, especially in the local governments, and also, I think he has studied a lot about the reservation for women and the impact of all that on corruption and development outcomes, specifically in Andhra Pradesh, but I think it's a general perspective about India as well. He has studied the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or NREGA as it is called in India. And using that to study the poverty identification in another South Indian state of Karnataka, where IMB belongs. He has published a narrative. He not only he does a lot of technical work, but also he does a non-fiction book, Last Among Equals, on the village politics in Bihar. And I think he has also written a fiction called Blue in 2014. And his experience as a researcher and as a policy economist with research organizations, state governments, central governments in India, I think Professor Sharan is just rightly placed to talk about the discussion today, which is inclusive growth a mirage? So that actually is the title. We have a subtitle which says institutional and technological innovations, both in India and in Japan. I will briefly introduce to you the other panelists who will presumably join in a few minutes because for some reason, because as I was just sharing with Professor Sharan, we are all in different time zones, and I think that could have been a challenge for some of the participants to join here. But we are expecting her to join very soon. So I'll give you a brief about Professor Catherine Ibata Ahrens. She is a Vincent de Paul Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Global Asian Studies at the De Paul University. Her expertise lies in innovation, entrepreneurship in Asia, science and technology policies, women's empowerment initiatives, and inclusive innovation. Recent research focuses on technology leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship ecosystems, development in biomedical industries in Asia, the rest of the world also, but in Asia in particular. And she has written very many books. I think the 2021 award-winning book called The Pandemic Medicine that analyzes the global innovation system in drug discovery and access of all these discoveries to the as an essential medicines for the common man. And earlier, she had also written another book called Beyond Techno-Nationalism. I think that explores basically the biomedical innovation and entrepreneurship in countries like India, Japan, China, Singapore. I think all these books that she has written, apart from that, she has been involved with many initiatives. Like she has also served in METI, which is a state government in state government Japan, US innovations, entrepreneurship councils. So I think she has worn many, many hats, Fulbright Fellow at Kyoto University and Japan Foundation. And she has worked with many, as I said, Asian foundations, Asian groups. But specialization her includes innovation and entrepreneurship strategy. and economic development, policy analysis, science and technology policy. So her interests are very wide ranging, and I think when she joins, we will have the pleasure of her um, uh, hearing her perspectives on all these her areas of interest and specialization. The topic today is about inclusive growth, um, with perspectives from India, of course, in Japan, because it requires a paradigm shift if you look at it, because we need to look at it through rigorous institutional reforms, technological advancements, but achieving genuine economic inclusivity. It is a big challenge in different societies, and each society is addressing it in a different way. So it will be very interesting to hear what are those success parameters, where it has worked, and what could be the reasons why it doesn't work. And because that will help us to challenge our existing paradigms and create, environment for sustainable development in all all our countries. So in this webinar, uh, as I said, is inclusive growth a mirage? We will delve into the essential facets of technology, leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurial ecosystem development, and the biomedical industries of Asia. That will be one of the focus areas. Our discussion will encompass innovation, entrepreneurship strategy, policy analysis, economic development, and shedding light on high-tech advancement in biomedical and life science entrepreneurship sectors in India, Japan, and other Asian countries. The exploring the intersection of political economy and international relationships. We will try and look at the research which is focusing on addressing inequality in socially diverse contexts. I think the webinar will attempt to spotlight the role of institutional technological innovation in empowering the marginalized communities in societies of both developing and developed countries. Additionally, the session will try and highlight significant studies which are related to rural, local government institutions, including grievance redressal mechanisms, impact of reservations for the marginalized groups, and innovative approaches which societies and governments have been following for identifying poverty, providing a comprehensive perspective on inclusive growth in these growing and changing dynamic regions of the world. I hope we all gain valuable insights into the transformation potential of both technology and innovation in promoting inclusive development. We will have a quick introduction, a quick presentation by each of the panelists, and then we will have a discussion. And final part will be a Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Sharan. And if you can take us through, Professor Sharan, and your perspective about this topic, then when she joins, she can share her perspective, and then we will have a conversation going. So, Professor Sharan.
Thank you so much, Saidip, for the introduction. And thanks to Shivam and everyone else who's organized this. Very honored to be giving this talk. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we get started. First, let me share my screen.
Yes.
I think this is the right one. Can you see my screen?
Yes. All
Okay,
set.
excellent. Okay, that's great. And I really hope that Catherine joins because I was hoping this would be a dialogue where I would talk about, institutional and technological innovations from a government and policy perspective, and she would bring in and with a focus on India, and she would bring in the market and non-Indian setting into the picture. But
Correct.
with that caveat in mind, let's kind of get started. So the topic, as you know, is inclusive growth or Mirage. And I thought, what better place to think about inclusive growth than the Indian state of Bihar? For those who don't know, and there are some people here from Japan, Bihar is arguably India's poorest state. It also has over 13 crore individuals in the in rural areas, which basically translates to Bihar itself alone being the seventh largest country in the world. And if you want to see it another way, about 4% of all people living in a democracy in the world live in Bihar. So Bihar is both poor, backward, but also kind of really large. And therefore, the people of Bihar, in some sense, are a microcosm of the people of the least developed parts of the world. Um, and so, therefore, Bihar both requires growth, and because Bihar is also a society ridden with hierarchies of both caste and gender, Bihar needs inclusive growth, not just growth, right? And so, there are many ways in which I thought I could formulate this talk. And what I'm going to do here is kind of give you a picture. I won't tell you about everything about inclusive growth in Bihar. Instead, I'll give you three separate instances of institutional and technological innovations, either by the state or by individuals in Bihari society who come from very marginalized groups, and kind of use that to kind of step back and then ponder and think a bit more about what it means to have inclusive growth. Okay. So quickly, I'll just get some definitions out of the way. So when I say inclusive growth, what I mean in this talk is that growth that takes everyone along. So everyone should benefit from the growth. And when I say growth, I mean growth, increase of growth in GDP. And when I mean everyone, I'm particularly going to focus on what Indians call Dalits or disadvantaged caste groups called scheduled castes. These are historically marginalized individuals who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy and have been discriminated against for centuries. And the Dalits of Bihar, in particular, are kind of doubly discriminated because they come from a really poor state. And within that state, they are amongst the poorest people. Okay. When I say institution, the institution I'm going to focus on is local government institutions in Bihar. As Saideep said earlier, this is an area of focus of a lot of my research. So I thought I'll kind of focus on that particular institution. And when I say innovation within that institution, I'm going to focus on three separate ways, three separate policy innovations that all kind of contribute to more inclusive growth through the institution of the local government. So I'll start off by talking about grievance redressal. Grievance redressal is basically a complaint system that anybody can use in order to complain against the local state. When I say the second thing I'll look at is peer learning. Peer learning is something that, this is a lot of you here are academics, so you know this. This is people learning from each other. But instead of looking at students, which is typically where we think about peer learning, we're going to be focusing on local government actors. So these are elected leaders and whether they can learn from each other to govern better. And that's kind of an institutional innovation. And finally, I'll spend maybe 2 minutes talking about collective action, which is kind of people who are outside the state. So ordinary citizens coming together in order to make the state work better. I'll talk about these definitions in much greater detail as we go along. Um, but before we get to all of that, let me kind of prime you to think about what is the main fundamental problem in village society in Bihar. Okay, there are many ways to think about this. I'm going to kind of help you fix ideas. I'm going to focus on one character in local government in Bihar, and this is the Mukhya. Okay, the Mukhya is basically the elected village head. This is a typical poster. The poster on the right is, a candidate who contests for village elections. The Mukhya is all powerful in Bihar. Okay. And they typically, in the absence of reservations, they come from the powerful social castes. So they are either Bhumihars or Brahmins or Rajputs or Yadav. These are the most powerful social groups in the state. And why are they powerful? They're also powerful because they have not only de facto power, which basically means that their caste privilege allows them to kind of do whatever they want in villages and often rig elections or win them, but also they have de jure power. Once they win these local elections, they control all the development related funds that are allocated in the village. So you name the most important things. There's the finance commission that kind of allocates a lot of money to villages. All the finance commission funds are controlled by the mukhya, right? And so then there's the NREGA, there's rations, which subsidize food. NREGA is workfare programs. These are all welfare programs. And all the welfare program funds, how much funds to be allocated, who gets the funds, where should you build infrastructure projects, all of this is kind of being determined by the mukhya. Okay, so this is kind of a central person in whom a lot of power is concentrated. So the big question I'm going to try and frame this as is, how do we take the power that's concentrated in the mukhya and try and distribute it through institutional innovations to other people in village society in Bihar? Okay. So one simple way, a thought that will immediately come to many people's mind is, well, if the mukhya is so powerful and they are the elected village heads, can't you kind of have more elected village heads? Or can you not have more leaders in villages? Actually, this already exists. So there are these characters called ward representatives or ward members. And so a mukhya is basically the head of the gram panchayat or the village. And so the mukhya is the head of about 12,000 individuals. Within each gram panchayat, there are about 12 to 13 wards, all of whom have their own elected representative, the ward member. So each ward representative represents about 1,000 people. Okay, so mukhya is for about 12 to 13,000 and each ward member represents about 1,000 people. Now, ideally, in an ideal world, you'll take some of the power in the mukhya and distribute it to the ward member. Unfortunately, until very recently, ward members had no control over funds. So they could raise issues with the mukhya, but they had no control over funds. So in many ways, and this I think the Indian audience will get better than the Japanese audience. You can think of these ward members as the Trishankus of village government. Now, Trishanku is a mythological character in the Indian Puranas who essentially wanted to kind of go to heaven in his own earthly body. So he instead created kind of this halfway house between the earth and the heavens, and that's where he kind of floated. Now, why are ward members like that? Because ward members are citizens, but they are actually not just citizens, they're actually elected representatives. But they're not at all close to the high heavens of the mukhyas. They're nowhere there. They don't have the power, they don't have the resources, but they're not citizens. They're not mere citizens. They're somewhere between citizens and the mukhyas. And that's how you should think about them. So now one question, of course, is how do you kind of empower these ward members in order to kind of challenge the power of the mukhyas, right? One particular way, and is through what is called grievance redressal mechanism. And here's a picture of a ward member friend of mine. I just put it in here to kind of give you a face to kind of connect to. This is Mandesa Ram. He's a scheduled caste, a low caste ward member. He wasn't elected in the last election. He was ward member between 2016 and 2021. And Mandesa Ram was actually, the story of his story is that he was given charge of setting up piped water schemes in his village. So he could actually build, he was given the resources and the ambit and the to kind of build these infrastructure projects, but unfortunately he could never do it. Because there was some caste issues and the upper castes refused to let electric lines flow through their land in order to power the water pump in the ward. Okay, so there was this whole complicated problem that Mandesa Ram ran into. And so he had all these pipes laid out and everything, but unfortunately, he could not actually deliver pipe water to his constituents. And in the subsequent election, he was kind of voted out. Now, what could someone like Mandesa Ram do? Well, one of the things he could have tried to do was to, do things like grievance redressal, which is try and complain against the people who are giving him trouble. And I'll talk about Bihar's grievance redressal mechanism. The other thing he could have done is perhaps talk to other people like him. There must be other scheduled caste, low caste Dalit ward members across the state. Why don't you go and talk to them? Remember, Bihar has, it's remarkable if you think of the number. Bihar has 110,000 elected ward members. Okay, so that's 110,000 local democracies in the state of Bihar. Okay, and so Mande Saram could potentially learn from other people like him who may have these issues, and that's something I'll talk about in this talk. The third thing Mande Saram could have done is kind of get citizens to work with him, and together they all make a petition. So not just fight by himself, but fight alongside citizens. Okay, so let's do grievance redressal first. What exactly is a grievance redressal system? So Bihar is actually remarkable. Bihar set up this remarkably powerful system in 2016 that allowed citizens to complain against the government. And what that basically meant was that if you were a citizen and say that you had a problem with a pothole on the lane outside your house, you could just call up a number and say, "Hey, I have I have a pothole outside my house. I need it to be fixed." And then you would be called for a grievance redressal hearing where it would be you, it would be your roads inspector, and it would be a grievance redressal officer. This is an image of that. You have these three characters who are kind of sitting. This is the complainant, this woman. This is the grievance officer, and this is the local bureaucrat responsible for resolving the complaints. And so the three of them are having this kind of conversation, and they're supposed to resolve the problem within 60 days. So it's a very powerful system because it gives citizens the right to redressal, which basically means it's a justiciable right that citizens have to redressal of their complaints. Now, when we did some early work on this in 2016, we surveyed about 1,000 complainants. What we found was about a third of the complaints were actually being resolved. Now, you could think 33% is a small number, but think of the context we're looking at. We're looking at Bihar, we're looking at, a local government system. And so to have 33% of complaints being resolved is a really big deal. So it's a reasonably powerful system. And remember, this system was actually built for citizens. Now, in 2018, we kind of, by fluke, my research team, this is the grievance redressal system, my research team kind of spent a lot of time kind of studying this grievance redressal system. And I was a grad student at Harvard. We set up a team that worked with the Bihar government that kind of tried to improve the system. And one of the cool technological innovations we kind of saw was that they had an extremely good software tracking system. So every complaint was logged digitally, and every complainant got a token, and every complaint had a token number. And so you could actually track every single complaint from start to finish in the system. And from the moment you file the complaint, you would be in the system. Now, there were three ways you could file the complaint. You could call a number, you could go online, or you could go in person. Now, because this was Bihar, over 75% of complaints were actually filed in person. They were not filed online or through technology. But it was still remarkable that, you have over 1 million complaints being filed over the last 6-7 years. So that's a lot of complaints. Okay. So one of the things that we chanced upon, my research team and I, by kind of fluke, was that we met another ward member, just like Mande Saram, another scheduled caste ward member called Kamal Maji. And Kamal Maji's big problem was that he was given charge of building these pipe water projects that you see on your screen. So this is a pipe water project that goes straight to the house, and building these kind of local lanes and drains in his ward. But unfortunately, his mukhya, the village head, was an upper caste man who refused to release funds. Okay. So Kamal Maji basically went running from pillar to post, trying to figure out how to kind of tell somebody about the fact that his mukhya just refused to give him money in order to implement these projects. Now, at some point, somebody told him, why don't you file a complaint under the grievance system? Okay. And that's exactly what Kamal Maji did. He filed a complaint under the grievance redressal system. He was called for a hearing. And lo and behold, the system actually worked in his favor. And the grievance redressal officer compelled the mukhya to release funds. And Kamal Maji actually not only built the pipe water project, but also kind of ended up getting re-elected. So he had the opposite experience of Mande Saram. Okay. And what is really interesting about the whole story is that the grievance officer was actually an upper caste man himself. So it's not that the whole system is filled with bad upper caste people. There could be good and bad upper caste people. And actually, the grievance officer who helped Kamal Maji was an upper caste individual who just followed the letter of the law. Okay. Now the big question is Kamal Maji like an anomaly, or is Kamal Maji actually like part of a larger system? And so what we did was we ran this kind of, once we figured out Kamal Maji's story, we thought, well, can we actually see if this system actually works? So what we did was we ran this kind of large randomized control trial, which is kind of some kind of A/B testing. I'm guessing a lot of you in the audience know this. What we did was we took about 1,600 low caste ward members who had trouble implementing projects, exactly like Kamal Maji. And 800 of them, we offered them the chance to file a complaint. So we said, we'll file the complaint for you online. All you have to give us is a one-time password that shows up on your phone. Once you tell us the password, we can file the complaint for you online, and then you will get called for hearings, and it's up to you to show up. First thing we noticed was about 40% of people who we offered to file a complaint for actually said, yes, file the complaint. But the more interesting thing we noticed was that about 6 months later, when we went back to these treatment and control wards, when I say control wards, I mean that there were 800 people who we didn't offer to file a complaint. We just kind of, spoke to them and then we cut the call. We found that in the treated wards, there was a 26% improvement in project initiation and functioning. Okay, so we actually did a survey. We got this from the survey that there was a clear difference. And so what this basically told us is that you could use this technological innovation, this institutional innovation called the grievance mechanism, combined with technology, which was the internet and this tracking system under the grievance portal, to actually empower marginalized groups, members like Kamal Maji. And we actually showed that this works at scale. Like 1,600 ward members is a pretty large randomized experiment, and so we showed that this works. So this is one piece of work that we did. The other thing we're now doing, which is what I said earlier, which is that there are 110,000 ward members across Bihar. And one of the surprising things is that Mandesaram, who kind of did not really speak to many other ward members, is not an anomaly. In fact, 80% of ward members in Bihar never speak to another ward member about work who's not in their village. So you have 10,000 ward members, and you only speak to the 10, 12 in your village, in your Gram Panchayat. You never speak to anybody else. So what we thought we would do is, can we set up these groups, these ward member meeting groups, peer groups, where we just get them to sit in a room. So these are all ward members in this image. And we get our facilitators to just get them to talk. So they do these ice-breaking sessions, and they just let these ward members just talk to each other. And so we're running that experiment as we speak now. We're running this with the Bihar government. So the Bihar government is running this with us. What is the technology element in this? Well, we do conference calls using both WhatsApp and Zoom, and we do WhatsApp messages. So we have these kind of 2,400 ward members in 206 peer groups across 10 districts of Bihar, who are all kind of meeting once every 8-9 months, who are part of conference calls and who are part of WhatsApp exchanges. And the big question we're trying to ask is, what happens when ward members from different villages are made to meet and made to talk? So this is still ongoing, but this is again an institutional innovation we're trying to pilot with the government of Bihar in order to see if peer learning, which seems to work really well in many contexts. So many of you know education, but it also works in industry. Everywhere people learn from each other. Can politicians do the same? That's the question we're asking, and that's the innovation we're trying to test. This is ongoing. We don't have results yet, but this is another example of an institutional innovation that we're kind of working on. Hopefully, next time this year, we'll have some results. What we also did was, because we knew that, scheduled caste ward members are going to benefit the most from something like this, we oversampled them. So our treatment and control groups have a little bit more scheduled caste members than actually their presence in the underlying population. And the whole experiment is run across 7,700 ward members. This actually, if you look at just the population, this experiment is run over 38% of Bihar or 25% of Bihar's panchayat. So this is a huge experiment. And the government of Bihar is, co-running this with us, which is great because all the meetings, in-person meetings, happen in the district collectorate. And the invitation goes from the government itself. So that's something that we want to test, and we'll see. And then the final thing I want to spend maybe just 2 minutes on is collective action. So now we move away from the government and see if citizens can themselves come together. And these are, again, Dalit and marginalized group members. And so this is, I've written a book about these people. They are called the Manrega Watch. Manrega is the Hindi version of saying the NREGA, which is a workfare program that provides work to millions of workers across the country, and the government itself provides work under the program. So it's a welfare program. And the Muzaffarpur People's Movement basically mobilizes members of EBC, extremely backward caste, and Dalit women to kind of come together and collectively put pressure on the Mukhya and say, please give us work. Please make sure that this happens for us, right? And the founder of this is this individual you see at the bottom of your screen, Sanjay Sani. He has a remarkable story. Again, somebody who owes a lot to innovation, to the technological innovations of the internet. Sanjay Sani basically discovered corruption in his village through the internet because the Manrega website logs every piece of information around the scheme on a nationally managed MIS, Management Information System. So Sanjay Sani discovers corruption, decides to give up his electrician's job in Delhi, goes back to his village, and then starts this movement. And for the last 10 years, he's been running this movement alongside all these women. And, there's a lot of technology involved even here. So this is the book I wrote on them, called Last Among Sequels. But basically, what is the tool of collective action? How do they bring people together? Well, they have this thing called the mobile radio. So they use a radio system that kind of sends out regular messages to all workers across this. This is mostly in Muzaffarpur, but a couple of other districts, about 100 to 200 panchayats. They also use WhatsApp to coordinate activities. So there's there's a work demand protest going on somewhere else, or there's a work site that's opened with new work being provided. Everything is on WhatsApp. You see these really illiterate women who can barely sign their own name using WhatsApp, using just using voice messages and images to communicate exactly what they want to say. I mean, it's truly remarkable. It also tells you again that very marginalized group members can be empowered through technology and through the innovations of technology, right? So to kind of quickly wrap up here, I think I'm a bit above time. I'm a couple of minutes over time. The question is inclusive growth or Mirage? And growth is both the domain of the markets and the state, right? But you could think of growth kind of being propelled by the markets and privatization and reform. But inclusivity is mostly the domain of the state, right? You need the government to kind of make sure that those who are left behind are not entirely left behind and they are showed up in some way. And for the state to really kind of pull up those most in need, it needs to innovate. And the innovations often come using technology. And I've given you 3 examples of different types of innovation, 2 from the state, 1 from the people. And it is also simultaneously true that Bihar still remains amongst the poorest parts of the world. So it's not enough that you do some innovation. You still need growth. You still need a bunch of other things. However, it is also true that since the mid 2000s, when Bihar kind of emerged from a phase of real darkness, they used to call Bihar the jungle Raj at one point in the 90s and the early 2000s. Bihar has emerged to grow at a really fast rate. I mean, there's a very low base, but it is true that Bihar is growing. And what I want to kind of end with is to tell you all that, even a place like Bihar, which is extremely poor, which is not known for state capacity, can still provide examples of innovation. And let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think one thing which stands out, Professor Sharan, is the passion that you feel for all this. I think, so if I may ask you, I don't know whether it's a personal question, but how does a chap like you, who has all the good things in life and you made it in many Indian eyes, that you made it to the top, institutes, and you're working very well. So how does a chap like you end up studying these underprivileged? So what was the motivation? We would like to understand you a little better.
Okay, so it's a great question. I think I took economics, and which is an unconventional choice. I grew up in the South, and you're either engineer or doctor. My parents are doctors,
Okay.
but I had cousins. One cousin who studied in Delhi University, who was like 10 years older than me, and she encouraged me to kind of think about beyond engineering and medicine. Um, and a lot of my economics classmates in my both bachelor's and master's ended up going to the private sector. I think I did fieldwork in Karnataka in 2010. I went around villages in around Udupi, which is where I grew up. And Udupi is actually the exact opposite of Bihar in many ways. It's very developed, it's a affluent set of villages. And but I learned even in Udupi, what I really saw was that, there were these scheduled caste and scheduled tribe men and women who lived very differently from everyone else. And it was
Right.
striking. Even then you saw it and then you realized. The other lesson I learned from it was the power of the state. So because while everybody else kind of benefited a lot from the markets, like, Udupi is rapidly urbanizing. I mean, it's no longer the beautiful, green, quiet coastal district of 50 years ago. It's actually a semi-urban or majority urban area in many parts. Um, Yet there were pockets of poverty, and for in those pockets, the only thing that helped people was the state. So I realized two things that, if you really wanted to make a change, you have to work with the state in some way. And I just did not have the courage to try for the civil services. And secondly, I mean, I just thought it was a time investment with uncertain returns. So I thought, PhD is a more certain, process. But secondly, I also learned that marginalized group members, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, women, these are the people who benefit, who still need a lot of help from people like me who can kind of bring research and policy kind of together. And so I kind of veered in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that was uh, because you're talking about already somebody who has got everything in life, but wanting to help these people through by creating not only structure but also maybe other methods. Structure is, as you rightly said, inclusivity can only be brought in by the state. But I mean, you are basically an economist, but how would you think of it that in ideal world, capitalistic world, um, the state is supposedly has very little role to play. So, do you think ideal capitalism, uh, will it ever uh, be available in its true form, where the state need not actually be there? Do you agree with that, or do you think capitalism needs to be reinvented?
I think so. Let me give you two examples. One is, I live in the US at least 6, 7 months a year. I'm here. And in many ways, it is the paragon of capitalistic society. I think the big problem with the US capitalism is the healthcare system, right? And it's a complicated, privatized, insurance-led system
Yeah.
that basically is both extremely costly and doesn't seem to actually do what it set out to do, which is to kind of try and provide affordable care for everybody. And so you see these kind of very clear left behind populations, minority groups like blacks, sometimes poor Hispanics, rural areas. Even in the US, you have very poor white people in rural areas in the US too, right, who struggle to get healthcare. So I do think that there are limits to how much capitalism can do. I definitely don't think that capitalism is entirely bad. I think that much of the wealth that we see created around us is because of capitalism. But I also do think that it needs to be reined in, especially when there are obvious cases of market failure. And we know that markets fail when there are feudal structures in society, which is what is the case in a lot of rural Bihar, for example. When there are kind of caste, for example, is a natural barrier to inclusive development, and capitalism by itself will not solve the problem of caste. You still need intervention. The law should change, government should do more, and they are doing more. Similarly with gender, so there are certain things that a capitalistic market doesn't necessarily always reward merit. It rewards merit plus privilege. And so to take care of the privilege bit, I think that's where the state can play a big role.
Very right. I mean, I agree with you. The only thing is, those who look at it in terms of either reservations, I think even within the
Yeah.
US context, many universities seem to have taken a stand against reservations for the blacks or giving special privileges for black students. So, in that context, if you, of course, US is different. I understand that, but contextually or figuratively speaking, reservation in any form, uh, do you think is good, or it will lead to sort of, because we talked about Supreme Court with, limiting it to 50%, and
Yeah.
then there are other ways to make it 60%. So all these things, where will it end? It's a vicious cycle. So
Yeah.
reservation, is it an answer, or is there a way we can um, circumvent this concept of reservation and uh, instead look at the root causes? As you rightly said, um, casteism is a issue. But is there a way we can power them so that they can reach the next level um, without the concept of reservation? What do you think?
Um, I mean, so let's historically speaking, even Ambedkar, who kind of championed reservations in the Constitution, thought it will be a 10-year process. He never thought it would be
Exactly.
it would be around for 70 years. And you could argue that maybe he overestimated how powerful reservations would be. Uh, that being said, let me start with the area that I'm most familiar with, which is local governance.
Right.
What we find, again, using a lot of data from Bihar, we do find that, when in the absence of reservations, which is the 2001 local elections, which is the first local elections under the new Panchayati Raj Act, less than 1.5% of leaders were scheduled caste, which basically, and scheduled castes are about 17.5% of the population. So they were massively underrepresented. And then in 2006, the law kind of came in. It said, the Nitish Kumar government basically said you have to have reservations, and it said up in proportion with their share in the population. And what we find using data from the census and then the socioeconomic caste census is that reservation actually does reduce inequality between scheduled castes and non-scheduled castes without compromising on overall efficiency. So the
I see.
big argument against reservation is that, these leaders come in and they don't know anything. And so they basically compromise development overall. They may help their own people, but they don't help everyone. We find no evidence that
Mm,
these people are actually bad for the panchayat as a whole. If anything, they help their own type. And the people who lose out, in some sense, are the historically very powerful groups who are anyway very wealthy, and they have many other ways of making kind of staying afloat. Now,
okay.
we find that the effects are even stronger in the long run. So in Bihar, the reservations ran for 10 years, unlike the 5 years. And what we
Right.
find is that the biggest effects are actually coming after 10, 12 years, because once you have reservations for 10 years, you are building a whole new cadre of leaders who are
Right.
winning in the absence of reservation. That is the ideal goal of reservation, that you don't need it anymore. And that's exactly what we are beginning to see in Bihar, that there was a five-fold increase in the arrival of new leaders who are scheduled castes in places that were formerly reserved but currently unreserved.
I see.
So you're seeing this new cadre, and they are pushing the political benefits to economic benefit story narrative forward. So there's like a nice virtuous cycle. Political benefits kind of results in better material well-being, which results in more political benefits, which results in more well-being. It's kind of really nice to see that, and we show that using data.
Wonderful.
That
I
being said,
think,
yeah,
sorry.
let
No,
me
no,
say
I
one last
was
thing.
very happy. Yeah, you
Yeah.
had a point. Sorry, I
Yeah,
interrupted.
yeah. I was just going to say the last thing, which is that that being said, we can also do one thing better, because we use the reservation algorithm, and it allows us to make a lot of very interesting causal comparisons. We
Mm,
ask, where does reservation work best?
mm,
Does it work best when, scheduled castes are a big share of the population, or they're a small share? And
mm,
what we find is that in villages where scheduled castes are neither too big nor too small, that's where reservation seems to have the best benefits for everyone. And the
oh,
reason that's happening is when they're really small share of the population, they are unable to win elections in the absence of reservation.
correct.
But when they're really big share of the population, they win elections anyway. And even if they don't win, the upper caste have to take them into consideration, because these people are a big enough chunk. So it's when they're in the middle share, when that they benefit from reservation. And once they get the benefit, they're able to contest and win even in the absence of reservations, and that kind of. So that's what we're seeing in the data.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you. I
Yeah.
think uh, great insights. Only thing is, in terms of practical uh, application of your great finding, where it is most effective, we will need to discuss and debate. That we will do
Yeah.
it very soon. But
Sure.
now Dr. Catherine has also joined. There you are. Welcome to this forum. And
good morning. I just received the link about 5 minutes ago.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, and my schedule confirmation said it would begin at 10 p.m. Chicago time, and it's not quite 10 p.m. I feel like a student who has arrived an hour late for class. I don't know what's going on. What did I miss? I have to give a presentation. Hopefully I won't repeat what was already said. So we had daylight savings change a month ago, and perhaps that was missed in the communication. So my apologies for not reminding everyone that we fall back an hour in October. So thank you everyone for stepping in my absence, and thank you, Sharan, for keeping me on top of the schedule change. And I, for some reason, did not receive the link until just a few minutes ago. But thank you, Sharan, for sending it. Thank you.
Please accept our apologies for all this goof up. But can we? We had in your absence. We did three things. One,
Okay.
I quickly introduced our center. Two, I introduced both of you in your absence, of course. And three, we had Professor Sharan sharing his perspective, which was, I think you joined towards the end of that discussion. So it will be wonderful if you can share your presentation with us, and then we will have a few more questions collectively to you specifically, and collectively both of you.
All right, sounds good. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'm assuming I'm able to do so. And I will start my slide deck.
Yes.
Here you should see my
everything
slide deck here. We'll go ahead.
We can see you.
Is it good?
Yeah. Yep. All good.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank our hosts for this morning's conversation, and a special thank you to, obviously, Shivam for all of his background work, but also our kind moderator, Dr. Rotham, for his contributions for today, and of course, in his leadership in establishing this Meijin Samved series with the sponsorship from the Mizuho India-Japan Study Center. So thank you all to the hosts and sponsors. I'm delighted to be here. I just learned this morning that I was granted a fellowship to visit in India, sponsored by the Japan Foreign Ministry. So I'm very excited about that. So I will be spending my sabbatical time in Tokyo, Kyoto, and Pune. But I would love to be invited to visit Bangalore. It's on my bucket list. I've always wanted to be there. So I'd love to visit you all in Bangalore and have some tea.
Our pleasure and privilege.
So without further ado, I'd like to, again, and apologies if this is repeating what was already said by Professor Sharan, and I'm so glad he was on time. So I just wanted to start, before I go on to the slide deck, and I'm actually going to cut off the end of it. I'm only going to focus on the Japan case studies, but I'm happy to field questions. I added an India case study in there because I was just so delighted to be able to, again, speak with an audience that I am Bangalore, who are more familiar with the biotechnology clusterization process there in your local economy. But I want to start with a few definitions today before I advance to the next slide, and that is to share with everyone, students at the undergraduate and graduate level, difference between economic growth and economic development. So on a macro level, economic growth is measured quite easily by identifying 2 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth. Economic development, on the other hand, is more meaningful in terms of the return on investment to the people who live in a place, in terms of increasing the standards of living and, most importantly, the quality of life. And this is something that I find that Japan has excelled quite well in the 20th and 21st century, which I'll get into in my remarks that follow. And that is that inclusive nature of economic development that is built upon economic growth. So it's very redistributive, first and foremost. It is inclusive, meaning although it is led by the major meritocratic ministries, again, which I'll get into in a moment, and focused on the big players, it also doesn't forget to include the small players, the small mom and pop stores, the local economies, the depopulated rural communities are really integral to the economic development policies, economic growth and development policies of the Japanese government. So it's inclusive rather than being exclusive. So exclusive would be focusing on the big dominant players. So most people perceive Japan as focusing on these keiretsu groups, and that the METI, the ministry in charge of economy, trade, and industry, is focused primarily on them. And that has been true for the majority of the post-war period in the 20th century. But in the last several decades, Japan has really, at a national level, taken some regional best practices and emulated it and scaled them out at the national level. So I will just go on to my next slide. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the conceptual framework from a book that I published a few years ago, right before the pandemic, in fact, by Stanford University Press, on the topic of biomedical innovation and entrepreneurship in Asia. And so I'm going to be drawing on some case studies as a way to illuminate these developmental processes and contextualize these processes within the historical narrative of Japan becoming a high-growth economy that also had inclusive development. And so there are two key features of Japan's economic growth and subsequent economic development in the 20th century. One is to focus on this developmental aspect, this redistributive aspect, and there are two sub-features below that. And again, I don't want to presume that your audience is familiar with all of this, so I'm just going to mention them briefly, and I'm happy to sort of talk about them specifically in the Q&A. But within the first key feature of inclusive economic growth and development in Japan is universal healthcare. And this is very important in the 20th century of Japan, so that particularly prenatal care. Now, that might not seem readily apparent in terms of how does this relate to aggregate economic growth and economic development? Well, if children are healthy, they stay in school. And that is the second subcomponent of the inclusive economic growth and development policy framework in Japan, and that is universal access to education. And so when you think about the Japanese ministries being meritocratic, these ministries are actually populated by many people from all over Japan. And I caught the tail end of Professor Sharan's comments about the caste politics in India. In Japan, some of the status hierarchies and class hierarchies are compensated for by these two features of the overall aggregate economy: universal access to healthcare and universal access to education, which is absolutely critical in developing future generations of youth who can succeed enough to go to university, post-secondary school, and for some, the elite of the elites, make their way into the top corporations and, of course, the ministries. Which is the holy grail for most parents. You want your child to get into the Ministry of Finance. It's got a 98th percentile. Only the top 2% typically get the posts, and then 95th percentile and above get posts in the other ministries. And so it's very, very much a competitive meritocratic system. There's very few incidents of political appointees in these ministries, which is why these civil servants are so dedicated to their jobs. The second key feature in Japanese economic growth and development in the latter part of the 20th century in particular is this notion of piloting and scaling. So identifying best practice on the ground in local economies, and by local economies, I mean Kyoto, Osaka, to some extent in the political and financial capital Tokyo, but more so in these hinter regions where there are interesting entrepreneurial and innovative things going on, particularly as related to academic entrepreneurship that comes out of the major universities in the Kyoto city region, which I'll get to in a moment. I would like to mention as an aside that in 2012, the then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, again, used this notion of universal access to healthcare as a public diplomacy, health diplomacy initiative that he began, or that his administration began in 2012 and has continued to this day. In fact, I will be continuing some research on Japanese health diplomacy in the coming years. But just to say briefly, the driving questions of this presentation is to really ask ourselves how have certain countries, including Japan, China, India, Singapore, the Asian tigers, Taiwan, etc., how have they been able to pursue economic growth that evolves or results in inclusive economic development, as I defined previously? Well, they've done so, I would argue, by engaging in strategic innovation and entrepreneurship through variations on techno-nationalism. And I'll get into the definition of these things in a moment. So again, just a very brief conceptual framework here. This is what I call the Janus paradox that has faced Asian economies in particular, because all but two of them, Japan and Thailand, all but two of them experienced the legacies and the destruction of Western colonialism, particularly British colonialism. And so these countries came out of World War II period, some of them newly independent, as you see in the case of India, and some that were economically decimated by the war. Japan was the aggressor, but nevertheless, it lost that war, and so had to rebuild its economy essentially from scratch in 1946 and 1947. And so these economies in the 20th century all were faced with this dilemma: should we open to the outside world and therefore have the opportunity for technology exchange, in particular inward foreign direct investment, et cetera, all the good things that come with opening your economy. But then there are bad things, there are risks. If they're too open and exposed to the outside world, then they become victim to the same kinds of exploitation of their economic space and their economic resources and the extractive capacity in the Western world that has been in place in these Asian economies for centuries through colonial and imperialism. And so Japan really was at a crossroads in 1947 and benefited, as a background, from the bilateral US-Japan strategic security partnership that started after Japan capitulated in 1946, 1945, 46, 47, with the imposition of American occupation on the economy. So Japan really, bad situation, but benefited from this massive unilateral transfer of wealth from the United States, but also the technology transfer in that period. So if we think about the Janus paradox in terms of economies looking to engage in knowledge acquisition, but also to engage with transnational networking to be able to have that tacit ability to have high technology entrepreneurship and innovation, we have these two sides of a quadrant. Again, political scientists, we like to think about things in terms of a 2x2 matrix when we're explaining things to broader audiences of non-political scientists. And so this is a typical way for us to kind of share our ideas and allow some debate and discussion around just a few aspects of how we can frame, should an economy open and be exposed in a global techno-national framework and position, or should it be closed? And going back to the Janus paradox, the god Janus was a mythical Roman god of doorways and shelter. And the Janus temple was open only during times of war. So what is this Janus paradox to which I refer? Well, as I said before, economies, national governments have the choice between being open and exposed to this opportunity to bring in inward foreign direct investment and technology transfer in particular, but also open and exposed to the threat. Or they could be closed and protected, but potentially left behind other competitors. And Japan really has had to navigate this space. And both Japan in the post-war period, all the way through the 90s, were relatively closed to outside incursion, particularly in terms of the allowance of majority shares in inward foreign direct investment acquisitions. And so Japan was very closed in its posturing. So what's the downside of that? It also becomes an insular economy that is not taking advantage of these transnational exchanges of network-based technology acquisition. And so while Japan excelled in the 20th century in its classic techno-nationalism, which really is about how states make strategic investments into frontier science and technology, a return on investment for that investment into K through 12 universal access to education, and from prenatal to elder care, universal access to healthcare, but also national regulatory frameworks that support traditional drugs and medicines as opposed to synthetic pharmaceuticals, which is another line of research with which I'm interested. So while Japan continued its classic techno-national posture, and as you know, India chose a different path to decouple from the colonial experience. And so actually India and Japan kind of had a parallel sense of being isolated from the global economy, but for different strategic posture reasons. So while Japan and India both pursued a more insular policy in the latter part of the 20th century, the other economies in Asia, particularly Singapore, Taiwan, did not have the same opportunity to choose to be closed and to choose to engage in export-led development or import substitution in the case of India. So if we think about these quadrants in terms of the definition of classic techno-nationalism, Japan remained in the 20th century over in that lower left-hand side in the codified and closed knowledge and network framework. So the Janus temple was very closed and protective to Japan, versus a place like Singapore, which was open and very exposed. And as I'll discuss in the Q&A, hopefully, why this has become problematic for Singapore's economy as those high net worth venture capitalists and also the industrial players have moved offshore to China because there's more of a return on their investment of their funds in China as opposed to Singapore. So again, I don't want to go over things that have already been shared, but just to give you an idea, I'm not going to explain each one of these things for the interest of time. Japan's developmental state model, which was popularized by one of my early mentors, Dr. Chalmers Johnson, who spent some time at the universities in California, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, and then of course Stanford University for a time. And so the components of what is called the developmental state that carried Japan through the last part of the 20th century and really allowed it to move quickly from high growth to, again, economic development that was inclusive for young people, for rural residents, for fisher folk who wanted to send their children to university. So a very inclusive, non-Tokyo limited opportunity for economic advancement on the ground in these local villages. But at the same time, the national government maintained a certain level of autonomy, and they had the legitimacy of the populace because of this universal access to education that prioritized hard work over sort of flagging students for their so-called natural talent. And so Japan has been very effective in egalitarian provision of education opportunity. Now, of course, parents who have ample funds are able to supplement public school education through either choosing to pull their children out and put them in private school, or to supplement a public school 8 to 3 p.m. education with a 4 to 9 p.m. Supplemental education at night, which is very arduous and is designed to get children into the elite universities. But that's another conversation, and I'm not an expert on that. But again, for the most part, it's universal access to education. And by market conforming state intervention, it's not compelling private sector actors to comply with dictate from METI and Ministry of Finance, but rather working with them behind the scenes to develop policies that they're willing to accept and implement without too much difficulty. And so you see in Japan and actually China in comparison sort of these very, very long time frames in terms of how long it takes to develop a policy, how long it takes to implement a policy, and this 5 to 10 year span where they're actually sort of tweaking things and trying things out. And they're giving everything a good 5-year practice period before they try to implement it in other parts of the economy. But at the end of the day, it becomes a national project. And then there's buy-in through working with what we call in Japanese the nemawashi, the sort of washing and the tending to the roots of your bamboo grove, so to speak, so that those networks that are required, those human capital networks that descend from the bureaucracy, but also from the legislature to a much lesser extent, but primarily from the private sector, are strong and resilient in times of economic shock, which unfortunately Japan experienced in the 1990s and has had some trouble in bouncing back. But if we take a look at the shift in the 21st century, which really originated in what is called the Kyoto model, the rise of the Kyoto model, and I've done a lot of analysis of this in terms of social network analysis on the venture capital flow of investments in that region. I haven't done a lot of research on it for some years, but nevertheless, the Kyoto model has articulated itself up to the national level in that the national government, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in particular, again, identifies these pilot projects that can be scaled out through two things. One, a capital infusion by the national government from both the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, but also from the Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and Culture. Long ministry, long story as to why it has such a long name. Lots of reform that happened around the 2000s. Which I can get to in the changing of hats. I can talk more in detail if you have questions in the Q&A. But what's really unique about the Kyoto model, going back to this idea of piloting, identifying what works on the ground, is these loose, permeable coalitions of entrepreneurs, but particularly academic entrepreneurs, and this funding model in Kyoto that has been attempted to be scaled out. It's still sort of a work in progress on the national level because some of the features of the model that depends upon this sort of tacit local community-based trust, which is why a lot of the venture capital in Kyoto doesn't get recorded on the books because it's what is called pocket money finance. And these deals are done on a handshake, which is a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with the bureaucracies and the ministries making these investments, because as we all know, anyone who is accepting Japanese national government funding, there's quite a lot of reporting and paperwork that comes with it, because the bureaucrats are responsible for monitoring and making sure that this the spending or the investment of limited Japanese taxpayer money is done so prudently and fairly. And so you find that a lot of these projects find themselves sort of shared across all of Japan, even in regions that may not be able to take advantage of these opportunities for lack of human capital reasons or lack of anchor tenant kind of like top level research one universities present. But in any case, the Japanese government tries to distribute these resources equally, which is fair and egalitarian, but isn't necessarily always a strategic investment, again, using limited taxpayer resources. But it does accomplish the goal of this idea of promoting inclusive economic development. And as an aside, I just had one of my students whose family is from Kerala submit a paper for his advanced undergraduate seminar in international political economy on the Kerala model of economic sustainability. And I found so many parallels with my own research in Kyoto. So it was a delight to read his paper, and I gave him an A. But moving on, how much time do I have? I think I've got a couple of minutes. Let me just move on quickly. But if you take a look at, if we're looking at techno-nationalism, network techno-nationalism, techno-globalism, and we look at the case study countries, I'm focusing here particularly on Japan. As I mentioned before, the role of a state is sort of protecting and nurturing these domestic firms in the sort of closed, protective Janus temple idea, subsidize them, help them to export. But the overall system architecture is closed to the outside. So on the one hand, it protects the nascent and the small, but on the other hand, it kind of holds back those particularly academic entrepreneurs that want to reach out and have vibrant international networks. It's much harder for them to engage in these sort of transnational tacit exchanges if they're taking particularly Japanese government money, because you know, and again, all governments are the same. If they give you money, they don't want you putting it in your pocket and packing up and going to San Francisco and using it in a different country, understandably so. In Japan's case in the 20th century, the posture to foreign participation in the domestic economy was very exclusionary, so keeping foreign influences out, as we all know. And so the key actors in the Japanese framework in the 20th century, and again, which has evolved through the identification of the success and the scalability of the Kyoto model on the national level in the 21st century, but for the most part in the 20th century remained in the sort of lower left quadrant of closed network posturing and protection of codified knowledge. In Japanese, we like to say "tsukue no ue no benkyo," meaning, you know, focusing on that book knowledge, that book learning, as sort of the basic nature of research, and which is why Japan, which is part of the reason why Japan still excels at basic science, is because of this very strong focus on codified learning. Let me just talk about a few of the cases and then open it up for Q&A. This is an entrepreneur that I've been following since he started his, I was very fortunate to be in Japan throughout the recessionary period of the later 1990s doing my dissertation work at Tokyo University Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology over on the West Campus in Komaba in the engineering school, working under the tutelage of a professor by the name of Kodama Funyo Sensei, who has since retired, but he was the architect in Japan of the concept of Sangaku or Sangakukan, later it evolved into. So it was the idea of getting universities and industry together to collaborate on, again, strategic investments into promising emerging sectors. And then eventually evolved into Sangakukan, which is like the inclusion of the elite ministries in that process of public-private partnership. And so there's a whole body of research that is developed about these public-private partnerships that I write more about in my more recent book on the COVID-19 pandemic, and not so much here. The focus here in this book from Stanford in 2019 is on the entrepreneurs themselves, one of whom includes this Professor Mujo Kim, who's a professor at Kyoto University, and he established in 1997 this company, Pharma Foods, which now employs, it has a market cap of over 2 billion yen and employs almost 300 people now. When I interviewed him in the late 1990s, he was just starting out, and it was basically him and a few other people and some bench scientists who were actually graduate students. And their first innovation was to develop a GABA amino acid, a lactobacillus, but also peptides in the use of nutraceuticals, but also to help produce antibodies for autoimmune diseases. It has since partnered with Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma, which is a subsidiary of Mitsubishi based in southern Kyoto. It was listed in the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 2021 in the top level, but also made it to the Tokyo Mothers Exchange in 2006 previously. And so it has really had a steady development history. And has offices really all over the world, and demonstrates that these informal human networks and the role of angel investors in Kyoto, as well as what I'd like to point out is Dr. Kim's hiring practices. He tries to maintain 1/3 foreigners, 1/3 women, and the rest Japanese men in particularly his technology staff. And so he tries to create this tacit international network through bringing in international high technology workers to reside in Kyoto. And, you know, Kyoto is such a wonderful place that it's easy to sell somebody to say, would you like to come and live in Kyoto for some time and work for my high technology company? It's a beautiful city. It's the Paris of the East, as they say. Unfortunately, Kyoto is a small local economy, and even though Dr. Kim has benefited from being embedded within this vibrant, particularly supportive economy for academic entrepreneurs in terms of the flow of venture capital, it does struggle with what is called the Galapagos problem in scaling out as a global company it's easier to do something like that in a place like New York or San Francisco than it is in the equivalent of the Japanese Midwestern city of Kyoto International, as though it may be. I'd like to talk a little bit about this company, which emerged out, actually began in 2003, but was established out of Kyoto University Institute for Integrated Cell and Material Sciences. These professors were actually collaborators with the Nobel Prize winning Professor Yamanaka Shinya, who did his groundbreaking work not at Kyoto University, but in collaboration with Gladstone Institute in the early 1990s. And Japanese government, again, this notion of the national level, identifying success on the ground in local economies within Japan, and then scaling out these successes by infusing massive amounts of national government investment. And so after Yamanaka Sensei was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2012, there was a significant infusion, particularly by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, that identified and recognized the success that they had in regenerative medicine and stem cell research. I remember going to a talk given by Yamanaka Sensei, and he was showing us this blob of cells that was beating like a heart. And this was, over 15 years ago. And since they have worked very diligently in making acquisitions. They have acquisitions here in the American Midwest in a city called Madison, Wisconsin, which is a little bit north of here. They've built out their patent portfolio based on Yamanaka's Nobel Prize winning research on pluripotent stem cells, as well as worked with the Kyocera founder and the Inamori Foundation in terms of helping to establish a critical funding hub in Kyoto's innovation entrepreneurial ecosystem. So giving back to the local economy and hence, reinforcing the positive developments on the ground in Kyoto. And so I'd like to stop here, and you have my slide deck if you want, for those people who can see the other slides. I'll just go through quickly. These are some of the other cases. You probably recognize this famous woman, the highest net worth self-made billionaire woman in all of India. Very proud and honored to have had her as a case study for this book, and actually the subsequent one after that, because of her civil contributions to sharing important vaccine support technologies in the global south. And so Biocon is just a fantastic example. But I was asked here today to talk about Japan, so I'm not going to talk about her, but I just wanted to share.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Catherine. So very much. You have given us a very broad and both at the, you can call it the forest level, as well as at the tree level, where you have taken up some case studies. One of the things which Professor Sharan was sharing earlier was some case studies that he has worked with in a state called State of India, called Bihar. And one of the questions which has been asked is also, which I think in the minds of many people in India, that we have some case studies or some success factors or success stories, but we are not able to replicate or scale it up. And you mentioned in your initial presentation that apart from the universal healthcare model and universal education system, the third thing that you talked about was Japan's ability to pilot and scale. And can you just take us through maybe three critical factors which helped Japan to do the scaling up, which may help all of us to scale up success stories which Professor Sharan shared with us earlier.
I'm sorry I missed those successful case studies. I look forward to catching up with you about that.
Yeah.
So Japan, just briefly, I don't know if I'll get to three, but one of the things that Japanese elite meritocratic bureaucrats are recognized is their ability to observe and be good students. And so Japan went through several decades of again being cash flush. And so they were able to, meaning the national government was able to take a lot of risks all the way through the 1980s on, automobiles, electronics, consumer durables, and lots of different things. And because there was so much money going to all of these industries, it wasn't so obvious the failures that were happening. And just like any kind of venture capital investment, you only have a 10% on average success rate. But after the collapse of the 1990s, the Japanese national bureaucrats had to become more judicious about these strategic investments because there was just less money to go around. And so they really started to be more selective, and were able to see on an aggregate level where the GDP was being generated and what kinds of products on which emerging sectors were. So being very mindful of looking at the patterns of patenting. Out of which universities, what kinds of technologies? Did these technologies actually become real products? Was there some university startup that resulted in that? And so this recognition of following the patterns and figuring out that there seems to be this sort of positive cycle going on in Kyoto that maybe isn't happening in other places. And so this movement from Kyoto in the pre-modern period, I love teaching pre-modern Kyoto political and economic history, but sort of coming out of this, the Heian period in the 1200s, where all of these artisans and artists and craftspeople flocked to Kyoto to be a part of the imperial palace infrastructure. And that technological development still exists today in the economy of Kyoto in the sense of fine craftsmanship and fine thin film technology, everything from painting the gold leaf in temples to that sort of attention to detail in painting a silk kimono that young Japanese families put $40,000. I mean, Indian weddings are as expensive in terms of what the women have to wear. But this sense of craftsmanship that translated into the fine film technology that became what were the first transistor radios, that became what were the first handheld gaming devices, which evolved into phone technology, thin wafer technology that is resistant to extensive heat or cold, and so therefore have aerospace applications, but also robotics applications, and also potential use in military. So broad cross-sector opportunity to build on the technological success. And so the national government sees this happening over decades repeatedly in Kyoto and decides to go there and figure out how this happened, and therefore learns about this pocket money and the Kyoto Venture Forum, and tries to emulate it and copy it at a national level. And again, it's an experiment that's still in process, but there have been some successes recognizably in other regions, in particular the entrepreneurial community that has emerged around Tsukuba University, which is north of Tokyo. So that's an example.
Okay. Professor Sharan, what is your take on how those case studies, two of the three that were successes and one of them did not succeed? So what is your, how can you do that? That if India, of course, it's not like Singapore or Japan, it is diverse and it is huge, it's big. So how can we scale up and scale up fast?
It's a great question. And I think you can flip the diversity angle on its head, and you can say it's so diverse that there is so much scope for experimentation. There's so much scope for learning across jurisdictions because, you have 1 billion people in over 2 million governments, local governments. So
Mhm.
actually, it is a space that is ripe for policy. You can test policies quickly at a small scale and then kind of get people to learn across jurisdictions. We just have to create that environment, which India hasn't been able to do. But I also want to kind of quickly say something else that Dr. Ibata Aaron said very nicely, which is that I think the big problem that India did never cracked was our healthcare and education systems are massively underfunded. Our public healthcare systems don't serve those most in need, and so that's also true for public education. In fact, we have amongst the most privatized education systems anywhere in the world. So, there's a bunch of issues that brings, which all of this other stuff, scaling up interesting policy innovations and stuff, is all secondary if you haven't cracked the first bit, which is to kind of just get the government to do the fundamental things that it needs to do well. And so that's the other thing I wanted to quickly flag here.
Okay, thank you. I have one question, slightly provocative, if I may use that word. These long periods, you said one of the reasons the government doesn't impose policies, but it sort of co-develops it with the industry. And so one of our earlier webinars, the speaker said the AI, for example, the technologies driving AI are something like, you know, many of these processes, as you know, there's a lot of debate whether it is safe, it is not safe, and therefore, governmental role in controlling these, you know, somebody called it a singularity. We are soon approaching one. And so if that is really so, it is a scary scenario. So the government needs to work and work fast, and not the Japanese way. So because by that time maybe we would have entered the singularity. Then there is no question of control. So what do you think? Do you think we need to change? I'm not just talking about Japan, but all governments are slow, but Japan seems to be more slow than the others.
Well, I think Japan needs a few Indians in the room to quicken the pace.
Okay.
No, but seriously, Japanese bureaucrats, some of whom are good friends of mine, the younger generation is moving a lot quicker. But it's just they're almost at the point where these elder statesmen are and they're almost virtually all men, so I feel comfortable saying that, are about to retire. And so I think that Japan is although it is facing this population and aging society existential challenge, as you're saying, a singularity like moment like we're having in AI. These younger generation of ministerial bureaucrats are looking forward to the opportunity to work with their younger private sector partners in advancing Japanese strategic investments and expanding these regional networks in particular. And as you might be aware, the United States and Japan, the national governments, the State Department, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan are pivoting towards a focus on working within the Indo-Pacific, particularly the Quad countries, US, Japan, India, and Australia. And so I think that this is presenting a policy opening for those of us who are interested in supporting the bilateral or the trilateral US, Japan, India partnership and the bilateral Japan, India partnership. And I know that I made that sort of aside that Japan needs more Indians in the room, but I think that there's some good synergies there in terms of thinking about frontier sectors, because frankly, there's just a lot more talent, particularly in this AI space, just by the numbers in India that you can see in Japan. So Japan has sort of this need for technologists, and India has technologists to offer. We just need to figure out policy mechanisms to encourage this sort of meeting of business cultures, which is which are vastly different, by the way. But that's another whole webinar. And I find that fascinating because I'm a Japan specialist and Japanese American, and so I just love I love everything about India that is so different from Japan on so many levels, including
Thank
this
you.
sort of youthful optimism, quick thinking, 2 minutes, 2 hours, but or 2 days or 2 weeks, but everything can be done in 2 minutes.
No, I think you're very right. But actually, as you rightly said, I think this seminar or this webinar deserves much, much longer time to explore all those key points that you both of you have brought in. Because we are seriously getting out of time. I would like to pose one sort of question to both of you. The question I had in mind was considering the intricate relationship between the political economies, the international relationships, and the concept of inclusive growth. How can interdisciplinary research contribute to designing policies that address the root cause of inequality? In fact, just before you joined, or I think just after you were there at that time, I was asking the question to Professor Sharan was, instead of looking at, you know, taking this the situation as it is today and finding some solutions to it through grievance redressal and other such interventions, can we look at the root causes of inequality and address those rather than just give a balm to, or I won't say balm, I would say instead of only looking at the demonstrated effects rather than the root causes. So, Professor Sharan first, and then Dr. Catherine next.
So that's actually it's a hard question in the sense that um, it is clear to me also that it's not one discipline or one methodology that's going to answer all questions. And I think interdisciplinary work plays a big role. And I think more conversations across disciplines is always welcome. I think that's how we kind of learn from each other. I mean, there are several fields of even the kind of field I do. I work in development economics, and one of the big things that development economics saw in the last 20 years is kind of this data revolution, where a lot more emphasis was placed on causal identification. And a lot of that was actually borrowed from the medical sciences and the literature there. So it's not that economists kind of came up with this. And similarly, if you look at behavioral economics, again, it's a field that kind of owes its roots in something like psychology, and then kind of econ kind of takes it forward in some ways. And so in the absence of interdisciplinary work, I mean, and I think as an economist, I can say this as an insider, I think economics has some very obvious biases and blind spots, and it really does benefit much more from engaging with people from disciplines outside it. I think economics kind of doesn't look at power seriously enough, doesn't look at the role that power plays in determining outcomes. When I say power, I mean social power, but also wealth, all of these questions. And these are all fundamental to the question of inequality. And so we don't model these things well. We don't even think of them. If you think of the standard economic model, we start with, everybody being the same clones of each other and rational agents. And that is kind of not particularly conducive for studying some of these questions. That being said, I think other disciplines can also learn from what economics has to offer. Fundamentally, things like measuring inequality. I think has done a great job over the last few decades, kind of really pioneering ways of kind of quantitatively measuring what inequality looks like. And people like Piketty have kind of taken it forward, but it builds on much more earlier theoretical work done by the likes of, Amartya Sen, but also people like James Foster. And so this dialogue has to happen. Otherwise, I don't see us kind of addressing root causes. And to my mind, I'll kind of go back and re-emphasize one point. To my mind, I think some of the root causes, the root answers are not that hard, even for places like India. Um, spending on things that, the state kind of intervening in places that matter, like education and health. Our higher education systems, public higher education systems are collapsing, not just primary schools and high schools, but think of the big universities in India that are central or state run. They were much better 30, 40 years ago than they are today. And these are all questions we need to seriously think about. And this is where the state can really play a role. And I think we need to focus more on that.
Just one quick follow-up question
Yeah.
with you before we go to Dr. Catherine. I think what you talked about, that it used to be much better earlier than it is today, is also partly the reason is that of the scaling up. We had 3 IIMs, now we have 30. So when you try to scale up without creating infrastructural, support mechanisms, etc., quality is bound to suffer. But so, in broader context, scaling up is always a problem. Whether you look at education success stories, because when you see IITs and IIMs, they were excellent at the beginning. They remained excellent for a long time. And then the expansion happened and the quality suffered. So I think scaling up issue, that is why I was asking you that question, that Bihar experiments that you are doing, scaling up would be a big challenge, and it should not collapse again. And after 20 years, again, another Dr. Sharan will do another study, and see similar effects, which has not seen across India or across the globe. Yeah. Anyway, so that is for just for food for thought. Yeah.
Very great points. I don't really have much to add, so I'm not going to also come in the way between your question, and I want to hear what Catherine has to say. But I agree entirely with a lot of your points. Scaling up is big. It's a problem. We're working with the government for precisely this reason. In Bihar, some of the work we're doing is with the government so that they can take the lessons. But it's not easy. And a lot of policy making is actually killed by a whimsical middle bureaucrat who only cares about their own reputation. And it's very different from the Japanese bureaucracy that is kind of committed. Here, often you are most interested in protecting your own seat. And so that kind of creates complications. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Dr. Catherine?
I do have a few things to say about interdisciplinarity, but I would like to actually ask both of you a question about where, in terms of this opportunity for scaling up existing best practice on the ground in local economies, where you see these best practices occurring on a local level in this vast economy that we know is India. So I'd be curious to think on that, and I'll answer the question briefly with a couple of data points. One is that, my expertise is primarily in innovation and entrepreneurship, but I've been working for the past 10 years mostly about this question of how do you foster inclusive innovation. And one way to do that is by inviting this not only interdisciplinarity, but different gender identities at the table. So if you look at, again, why fields like economics are so important in business is because you can actually have very effective ways of tracking that data over time through time series analysis to see, for example, in the United States, where you have diversity on corporate boards, you have more prudent investment portfolios, particularly when that diversity includes at least 1/3 of the board being women. So that just that one kind of diversity. So if you think about creative industries and innovation hubs, having that interdisciplinarity, I'm a political economist by training, and so I'm always looking at power. Because I've been trained in economics from the perspective of comparative politics. And so we're always looking at policy mechanisms and who's being invited to be a part of designing the policy in the first place. And you can actually follow the money trail to see whose interests are being represented in any given policy, particularly in the United States. But again, Japan's a different animal. And I could go on, but I would love to hear, before people start ringing off, your thoughts on identifying best practice on the ground in local economies in India.
Professor Sharan.
Yeah, so depends on what you mean by a local economy. So if you look at local governance, for example, which is the area that I study a lot in, I actually think that is, and I've said this earlier in this talk, I think a key area that we can actually do much more to learn from each other. So, part of what I was talking about earlier in my presentation was how we're doing this peer learning intervention, where we are getting local leaders to just come and sit and talk to each other. And what we find is 80% of village leaders have never spoken to another person who's another village leader from outside their village. So they all talk to people who are in the village, but they don't really talk to people outside. And we are writing a review of village local governance that's coming out sometime next year, and we're calling it 2 million democracies, because we have 2 million local government institutions. And so I think there is a lot of scope for cross-learning that's not happening, and that needs to happen. Now, what are some great examples of local government institutions in the country? I think, Karnataka, where IIMB and Bangalore, Karnataka has a rich history of local governance, all the way back from the Mysore state in the early 1900s. And a lot of what we see as the fundamentals of local government architecture in India actually owes it to a person called Abdul Nasir Saab, who in the 80s kind of pioneered local governance in Karnataka. So I would put Karnataka, at least the history of Karnataka, as a very good example of local governance institutions. I also think, some of the work we're doing in Bihar, the State Election Commission in Bihar runs an amazing show in terms of just collecting data on local governance institutions, making sure elections are conducted freely and fairly. And there is much that needs to be learned from that experience across the country. So here's 2 examples from my end on local governance.
Wonderful. Because we would invite, it has been so stimulating for me especially, and I'm sure for the audience. At some point, when both of you are free, we would like to invite you to come to Bangalore in person, if that permits,
Sure.
if permitted by your schedules. And also, as you rightly said, you are in Pune, Dr. Catherine, and Dr. Sharan, you are a regular visitor. So
Yep.
it'll be wonderful to have both of you here. And we can continue this conversation in person then, and learn a little more about the great thing. And also, we will have maybe another session like this on webinar, so that wider audience can also benefit from your insightful thinking. So thank you again. And
Thank you so much.